chapter 14. Beginning in verse 8. That one?
Yeah.
You like that?
Yeah.
I wish
He's a map guy.
I wish the whole thing
I love good
were
maps.
this part of the map, because why put it down here? Well, I guess because it shows the route.
Missionary trips.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to see way back there.
The original Google Maps.
Right.
Oh my goodness.
Right, so Paul and Barnabas get this idea from God that he wants them to venture out and spread the gospel message to places that haven't heard it yet. And they take the notion to the leadership at Antioch, and that happens to be where they're working at the time. And so leadership prays about it, and they get this okay from the Holy Spirit. They send off Paul and Barnabas and Mark out with their blessings and their support. And their first stop is Cyprus, the island of Cyprus here, and they preach all the way across the island to the other end, and they get a chance to address the proconsul there. And in this group is a magician named Elymas, who opposes them, and so Paul unloads on him, and he tells him he's going to go blind, and right before their eyes there he does. And as a result of the message and the miracle, the proconsul becomes a believer. And so then the troops sail from there to the mainland of Turkey, right up in here, and they're going to be ministering to this area right here. This is Phrygia, and it is part of a larger area called Galatia. You'll have to be familiar with that term. And and while they're there, they get kicked out of Pisidian Antioch, and they get plotted against in Iconium, and their next stop is Lystra. So let's pick it up there. Let's see. Harvey, can we start with you?
Yeah.
8 through 13, please.
Sure. At Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze upon him, and had seen that he had faith to be made well, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he leapt up and began to walk. And when the crowds had seen what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have become like men and have come down to us." And they began to call Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. How far?
13.
Okay. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifices with the crowds.
Okay. So Lystra in those days was mostly Gentile, and as far as anyone can tell, there was no synagogues there. Now, the ministry of Paul and Barnabas there was centered around a miracle involving a lame man. And it doesn't say here how Paul got the idea that the man had to have faith, to have the faith to be made well, but it must have been a Holy Spirit thing. And then, so Paul tells him to get up, and he does. And one of the amazing things to me about this miracle is that the man had never walked. So you can imagine the condition of his legs and feet. They had to have been so atrophied to be absolutely worthless. And when Paul told the man to stand up, so some amazing things had to happen to his lower limbs in a pretty short order. Right? Now, this caused quite a reaction in the locals, as you can imagine, and they began to talk about it in their native language, which Paul and Barnabas didn't understand. And so they had no idea what was going on until the priest hauls out this sacrificial ox. Now, this had to have been quite an important celebration, because an ox was the most expensive sacrifice that they had in those days. Now, the contention of the priest was that Paul and Barnabas were Greek gods. The god Zeus, who was the supreme commander, and Hermes, who was the messenger god. And you can imagine that there is some history behind this. And I'm going to give it to you. Now, we get this history from a first century poet named Ovid. And as the story goes, and it really obviously is a story, Zeus and Hermes take on human form. And they conceal their identities, and they go about the area of Phrygia, and they visit 1,000 homes in that area, trying to find shelter and rest, and they're repeatedly denied. Until they come to the home of an elderly couple, humble, poor elderly couple. And they take them in, provide for them, not knowing who they are. And the two gods eventually reveal themselves, and they take this couple to the safety on the top of a hill. And then they send a devastating flood as judgment on the land. And somehow the humble home of the couple gets magically transformed into a temple. Now, there is archaeological evidence for the worship of Zeus and Hermes in Lystra. And the residents of Lystra at this time would have known of this legend. And this accounts for their determination to honor these two gods and not allow this kind of thing from happening again. Right, so Jenny, could you read 14 through 18, please?
Sure. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing this? We too are only men, human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them.
So once Paul and Barnabas figured out what was going on, they were horrified. And the tearing of their clothes in the Jewish culture was an expression of extreme grief. It's just uncontrollable emotion that just takes over. And we see this in the Old Testament, and we see it at the trial of Jesus when the high priest tore his clothes. Now this prompts Paul to break into a short speech here. And his first response to what they're doing is that Paul and Barnabas are just men. They're just like them. They're not gods at all. Now contrast this with the response of Mr. Herod Agrippa I. And it got him killed.
Yeah.
So Paul and Barnabas are humbling themselves, unlike Agrippa. This is one of those good lessons. So then Paul proceeds to admonish them to turn from what they're doing, to turn instead to a real God, capital G God, calling their worship of false gods a vain thing. And his referring to a living God implies that their gods are not living. And that could really be the cause of some hostile reaction, which is what we're going to see here. Now, being polytheists, Paul needed to bring their thinking around to a single God who is not only the creator of all things, but the sustainer of all things, to the exclusion of all the other so-called gods. And Paul says this is evident in all the good things he has done for them. One God did it all, and there is no use for a multitude of gods to get it all done. Now, this little speech managed to work, and they refrained from sacrificing, and that lucky ox got to live another day. Now, notice what Paul's speech does not contain. There is no mention of Jesus. There's no mention of his death and resurrection. No mention of forgiveness or salvation. There is no recounting of Israel's history or the coming of a Messiah. There are only 2 occasions recorded where Paul preaches to non-Jews, here and in Athens. Now, there no doubt he did it a multitude of times, but these are the only 2 recorded. And on both occasions, he focuses on natural revelation, God as creator and sustainer, and the vanity of worshiping false gods. Joyce, you have Romans 1, 19 through 20.
Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse.
Okay, so if anybody ever wants to know about God, all they have to do is open their eyes and look around.
Right.
I mean, how can you deny
Mhm.
the existence of a creator God?
Mhm.
Right, so anyway, the point here is that Paul is tailoring his message to fit the audience.
Right.
Okay, one of those other good lessons. Chris, can you take 19 through 23?
Sure. Then some Jews came from Antioch
And
and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe.
Mhm.
They preached the good news in the city and won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. They said Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. I just kind of find it interesting that he's just like, okay, they stoned me. I was being half to death. Okay, I'm gonna go back in now. It's just like,
I kind of wonder about Paul's sanity.
yeah, I think that rock kind of hit him a little harder than anything.
Well, anyway, for the Jews to travel the 90 miles from Antioch to Lystra, they must have been pretty intent on putting a stop to Paul and Barnabas' activities here. Now, whatever this group said to the crowd had the desired effect. And this mostly Gentile crowd might not have been really very excited about what Paul's message was anyway, so the Jews might not have had to do too much convincing. But anyway, Paul gets stoned and he gets dragged out and he's left there presumed dead. And Paul goes from about to be worshipped as a god to being worthy of execution. Now this is quite a come down. And one might wonder why only Paul was stoned. What was Barnabas doing at this time? Well, maybe he was keeping a low profile to it all, but we really don't know. So Luke's account does not indicate who these disciples were who were gathered around Paul. Now they could have been people who were traveling with him, or maybe his speech had made enough of an impact on some of the citizens of Lystra there that they had created a following already. And it's very likely there was more to the story than what Luke wriits here.
Was Barnabas a Jew also, or was he a
Jew.
Gentile?
Barnabas
So
is
they were
Jewish.
both Jews.
Jewish, yes.
Okay.
Now, as Chris mentioned, this for Paul to go back into the city and spend another night there, that's kind of amazing. And Luke doesn't really tell us how he got away with it. So this is going to have to be to remain a mystery. So on they go to Derbe, and it's another 58 miles to the east. Now remember, these guys are walking. Everywhere they're walking. You know, they've been in pretty good shape. Now the only thing that Luke tells us about in this episode is that whatever Paul and Barnabas did, it worked. Okay? And after some success there, they reverse their course and they revisit Lystra and Iconium, and they reinforce the faith of the new believers there. And that's important because new believers need their faith reinforced. They can't just be turned loose. They have to be nurtured, same as it is today. Okay. Now, it's amazing to me here that after being kicked out of Antioch, plotted against in Iconium, and nearly killed in Lystra, that they ever wanted to go to those cities again. And this is belief. This is an absolute conviction that the message is more important than their well-being, even their lives. And they were risking their lives to go back into these places. And they're motivated by their commitment to the mission God has given them, and their love and their concern for these new believers. And once again, for the umpteenth time, no one does this for a lie. Now, notice Paul and Barnabas do not leave these new believers without leadership. He knows they're going to flounder without it. So he picks the most likely elders in the group, and he appoints them. So he left them with people to lead. James, do you want to read 24?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What I understand then is when they first went out, they went to the synagogues to preach the message. And then from there is kind of where they got their core group of believers. And then the second time they came, they went into their homes. That's where they were meeting, like in home churches rather than going
We don't
to
know that for
synagogues.
sure. We don't know
Not
that for
for
sure. Yeah. It doesn't really say.
I just was thinking that they're establishing leadership. It had to be different than what the synagogue leadership was. And-
Most likely, yeah,
Okay.
most likely was. Okay, James, you want to read 24 to 28?
And they passed through Pisidia and came into Pamphylia, and when they had spoken the word in Pergia, they went down to Attalia, and from there they sailed to Antioch, from which they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had accomplished. And when they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all things that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, and they spent a long time with the disciples.
So apparently Paul and Barnabas returned to where they could get passage back to Antioch, and finally Perga gets some preaching. And it doesn't say here what the response was. Maybe it wasn't too remarkable, I don't know. But it doesn't say why they decided to end their journey, but they did. And when they arrived back in Antioch, they give the whole church a recounting of all that went on. This is an important thing for missions, for missionaries to stay connected to their sending churches. And in their accounting, they use the expression door of faith here. And this kind of alludes to the language of Jesus when he describes himself as the door leading to salvation. You get that in John chapter 10. And at the heart of Paul's message is that believers enter the door of salvation by faith. And there's no mention of how long they remained in Antioch here. And they will receive word that some Jewish Christians in that area were changing the teaching of Paul and Barnabas. And this results in Paul's very first letter that we have recorded in the Bible, and that's Galatians. All right, on to the next chapter. Nancy, 1 through 5, please.
While Paul and Barnabas were at Antioch of Syria, some men from Judea arrived and began to teach the believers, "Unless you're circumcised as required by the law of Moses, you cannot be saved." Paul and Barnabas disagreed with them, arguing vehemently. Finally, the church decided to send Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem, accompanied by some local believers to talk to the apostles and elders about this question. The church sent the delegates to Jerusalem, and they stopped along the way in Phoenicia and Samaria to visit the believers. They told them, much to everyone's joy, that the Gentiles too were being converted.
Is that 1 through 5?
When they arrived in Jerusalem, Barnabas and Paul were welcomed by the whole church, including the apostles and elders. They reported everything God had done through them. But then some of the believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees stood up and insisted the Gentile converts must be circumcised and required to follow the law of Moses.
Paul and Barnabas are still in Antioch now, and a group came all the way from Jerusalem to straighten everyone out in the church in Antioch, and by now there were a good number of Gentile believers in Antioch. So here you have men from the circumcision party that are working independently of the leadership in Jerusalem, as we're going to learn here in a little bit. Now these men were Pharisees. So the circumcision party was apparently made up of Pharisees. And this kind of helps us understand their mindset. And these would have been from the more conservative end of the Pharisees, not all the Pharisees. And their contention was, as it was earlier, that Christianity needed to remain a Jewish thing. And so Gentile believers needed to become proselytes and follow the dictates of the Jewish faith. In fact, their contention was that salvation depended on it. And this makes it a pretty serious issue. Now we need to understand that these Pharisees were not bad guys. They were devout Christian Jews who were very concerned about the purity of their faith. And that is a very Pharisee thing. And their expectation was not unreasonable. Now their thinking was that these new Gentile believers were being added to Judaism. And traditionally they were required to go all in, including undergoing circumcision. So why, they're asking, should this change? Now we need to understand the burden this will place on Gentile believers. And Sarah's going to be here in about 5 minutes. She's going to give you a little bit more about this. And the Jewish law contained laws that were moral in nature. They were behavioral laws, and laws that were more ceremonial in nature. These would have been things like circumcision, kosher foods, ritual purity, sacrifices, festivals, that kind of thing. And besides the fact that circumcision would be extremely painful, to follow these laws would make it nearly impossible for the Gentile believers to function in their Gentile communities. Now, this was all pretty serious, and it led to some interesting discussions with Paul and Barnabas, and not being able to come to an agreement. A delegation, which included Paul and Barnabas, was sent off to Jerusalem so the two sides could plead their case before the leadership of the church there. And on the way, it says this delegation stopped at the churches on the route, and this would include towns like Sidon, Tyre, Caesarea, Joppa is not on this map, and then all the way into Jerusalem there. Now this is not an overnight trip. This is 300 miles. And with these stops along the way, it could have taken nearly a month. But it says the believers in these churches were quite excited about what was going on among the Gentiles. And the Gentile believers in these churches would have been especially excited because it would reinforce the notion that the church was open to Gentiles like them. And so they arrive in Jerusalem. And after reporting what Paul and Barnabas had done among the Gentiles, the Pharisees of the circumcision present their case. Now, just a kind of a point of information here. Notice it says that the circumcision delegation came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. Now, in our way of looking at things, we would look at this as up to Antioch. Our maps, north is always up. Okay? But to the Jews, their maps, up is east. Because that's the way you face the rising sun. It's the start of the new day. Now, they had no concept of a round earth turning around on its axis. So when you see in the Bible where it says to go to the left or to the right, it means going north or south. Okay? Now, besides this, to travel from Jerusalem to Antioch is to go from a higher elevation to a lower elevation, and that's probably what this is really referring to. You always either went up to Jerusalem or you went down from Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is in a high spot. Okay. All right, enough of that. Let's move on. Let's see. April, could you read 6 through 11, please?
Now the apostles and elders came together to consider this matter, and when there had been much dispute, Peter rose up and said to them, Men and brethren, you know that a good while ago God chose among us that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe. So God, who knows the heart, acknowledged them by giving them the Holy Spirit just as he did to us, and made no distinction between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. Now therefore, why do you test God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples which neither our fathers nor we are able to bear. But we believe that through the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, we shall be saved in the same manner as they.
Okay. All right, now that Sarah's here, I'm going to have her come up and share with you some insights that she has.
Well, hi. Do these masks make your nose run too?
Yes. Yep.
No, they just heat up my face.
Oh.
So we're going to pretend for a few minutes that we are a group of Gentiles that are new believers in the Lord in kind of the Asia Minor area. And we're going to just kind of take a look at what our lives might be and what sorts of things might change because we have come to the Lord. So we can start over here with Harvey and Janny. You guys are, you guys have a daughter. I'm not saying they don't have a son, I'm just using this example, Chris. You guys have a daughter, she's about 10 years old, and she's been having a lot of stomach pain for the last little while. You had a neighbor that had a daughter that had the same problem about a year ago, and they took their child to the medical clinic in the area, the major medical clinic, and that major medical clinic saved her life. She was getting really bad. She was sick for several days. She started getting a fever, and it saved her life. So you guys have this daughter. She seems to have the same exact symptoms. So you guys are thinking, well, should we take her to this hospital? Well, the problem is the hospital is called the Asclepion, and it is a worship center for the healing god Asclepius. So now you as new believers, you are sitting here, you have a choice to make. Do we take her to the hospital, which could save her life, and while at the same time that you're doing that, you are going to need to give some sort of allegiance to Asclepius in the process of taking your daughter to the hospital.
Right.
Chris, you're a slave. Sorry, buddy. You're a slave.
I'm not surprised.
So you're in good company. A whole lot of new believers were slaves, so that's okay. So you work for your master from sun up to sundown. That's just your slave. That's what you do. But you want to gather together with other believers. And the problem is the only time that you can do that is at night, after you're done with all your other duties. The problem with that is that it's illegal to gather at night in groups. So you have some choices to make. Are you going to gather together with your brothers and sisters at night, or are you not? Because you could get into big trouble for doing that.
Well, it's only curfew, so why not?
Joyce, you are you're a doctor at the medical clinic that they were thinking of taking their child to. But you just came to the Lord, and as a doctor at this medical clinic, that makes you a priest. We're going to pretend you're not a woman. So you're a priest that makes you, as a doctor, you're a priest at the Asclepion. So you have some choices to make. Are you going to continue to serve the Lord? Or are there other ways that you can use your medical knowledge? But you're going to have to make some choices about your job, because it's not compatible with following Jesus. Ken and Fran, you guys, Ken, you're a silversmith, and you work making little idols to Artemis, because you live in an area where lots of tourists come in and locals serve the goddess Artemis. You've been praying for a long time for your wife to get pregnant. And Artemis just happens to be the goddess of childbirth. You've been praying for a long time. She's now 5 months pregnant, and you guys came to the Lord last month. So you got some choices to make. You have a trade. You're a silversmith. You can make other things, so you can learn to make other things. And so you're leaning towards, you're already starting to make other things, and you're already starting to turn your back on Artemis. But the problem is, you really should be grateful to Artemis for your wife being pregnant now. You've prayed for a long time to Artemis, and now she's finally pregnant. Not only that, but she's the goddess of childbirth. And you don't want to tick off the goddess of childbirth right before your child is born. I mean, a lot of women die in childbirth. So you're already starting to make other things, but your wife is very concerned. And she won't let you get rid of your Artemis idols that are in your house yet. She says maybe after the baby's born. So you guys are in a little bit of a quandary there. Jim, you are a builder, and as a builder, you are part of a trade guild. A trade guild is something where all of the builders in the city are all part of the guild. It's a kind of a workers' club kind of a thing, where you're part of this trade guild. Other people will come to the trade guild and say, hey, I have this building project that I need done, and they'll look around and see who needs work that's in the trade guild. So they'll be like, okay, these guys need a building to be built. So they come to the trade guild and they're like, all the other guys in the trade guild are busy. Jim, can you build their building for them? And so that's kind of how you get work, is you be part of a trade guild. Part of the problem with being part of this trade guild is that there are these trade guild feasts that happen on a regular basis. You're part of, it's not just a workers club, it's also a lot of your social activity. And so part of this trade guild is you have these kind of trade guild parties, which have a lot of sexual immorality in them and a lot of alcohol. Wine is not a problem, everybody drinks wine, but it's an excess. Not only that, but there's idolatry. You're going to be eating meat sacrificed to idols there, and you're going to be expected to participate in the worship of the gods that happens there. So you're really wanting to, participating in these parties. If you don't participate in these parties, you're out of the guild. If you're out of the guild, you're basically out of a job in the city. You're not going to get much work unless you can get a little bit here and there privately. You guys have 2 young daughters. Your wife is very concerned about you getting out of work. It could be a big deal for your family. You're already just scraping along to make it. So, Backhoffners, you guys are, let's see, who shall we make you? Who shall we make the Backhoffners?
He's an engineer.
He's an engineer. Okay.
I could use another slave friend.
So Backhoffners, you guys are in the you work in the harvest somehow, and you are serving because you're involved in like agriculture. You're going to be serving the goddess Demeter, and so the goddess of wheat and of the harvest. And so you're having some concerns about worshiping her and doing that. So you have some big decisions to make coming up. You want to worship the Lord. You got some big decisions to make. Normally, if you had a really big decision to make, you would make the trek to an Apollo temple, because Apollo is the god who gives you messages. And so that'd be how you would normally handle that. You'd normally go take a little while if you had any really big decisions, and you would go to the Apollo temple. But now you're serving Jesus, and so you're not really sure that you can follow this Demeter anymore, and you don't have the option of going to the Apollo temple, and you don't really know, is God the God of wheat? Is God the God of your harvest? Is God the God that will give you your messages and tell you what to do? You don't really know. So you're going to have a little bit of a quandary there. Jerry, you are a wealthy man.
Ooh, all
Yes.
right.
You're a wealthy man in the city, and that means you don't work.
I probably work for him.
You probably do work for him. You don't actually work, because wealthy men don't work. It would be very shameful for you to work. And so you do a lot of just rubbing shoulders with the other wealthy men of the city. Your entire social life is all of these other wealthy men. Your social world is centered around the symposium, where you get together. It's a men's club sort of a thing where you learn things, and you hang out. This is your whole social life. The problem is much like Jim's situation. These symposiums are rampant with sexual immorality, and they also are rampant with worship to other gods. They have a plethora of wine, and the wine libations poured out to the god Dionysus. And you just don't really feel comfortable going to those places anymore because you can't really, as a Christian, participate in those things. So if you stop going to those, you're really going to be on the out with your entire social group. Your whole group will kind of abandon you. Not only that, but you realize that you are now a brother in Christ with your slave. And as such, you are starting to get together socially with people who are of a lower social class, because you're in a group like this with people like builders and slaves and people who work in the grain fields. You're really stepping over some extreme Roman cultural boundaries. You have destroyed the social order, and your snobbish friends do not appreciate that, because that is simply not done in the Roman world. So you're pretty much at risk right now of losing your entire social friend circle, your whole friend circle, which is your life because you don't work. Dad and Mom, you guys are, Dad is a leader in the city. He's kind of a politician in the city, someone who works on the city council and helps to run things in the city. The problem is that the city worships the emperor, of course. What city wouldn't worship the emperor? You'd be stupid not to. You also have some patron gods and goddesses of the city that you worship. During your city council meetings and stuff, you'll probably burn incense to these gods and goddesses. You will just participate in all the processions that happen throughout the city to the gods and goddesses of the city, which happen on a regular basis. And you're not comfortable with doing those things anymore. And so you have some decisions to make. The problem is that people are starting to call you an atheist because you don't worship those gods and goddesses of the city. As an atheist, you're really a liability to the city now, because to being on the political scene of the city, because what city can afford to tick off the gods? What city can afford to tick off the emperor as a god? That's just not done. So you guys are basically out. I mean, you're not going to be part of this leaders of the city anymore because of this. They can't afford to have an atheist in the city, on the city council. You don't want to anger the gods. So, Karen, you are a woman. You get to be a woman, unlike Joyce. So you're a mom, you've got kids, your husband is a leader in the new church, and this is all new to you guys. He's taking part of his time that he was working to be a leader of the church. He just can't put quite as much time in anymore to his job, which was already barely scraping by. So for you guys, you can't afford to do things like eating meat sacrificed to idols. Because if you're eating the meat sacrificed to idols, you're being a bad example to the rest of your community, your church community that's new. The problem is that that's the cheap meat. And so you guys, that's the only meat that you would be able to afford, probably. And if you wanted to go to a cheaper pub, they're all surrounding the meat market, which all that meat is all sacrificed to idols. Mm-hmm. So for you and your family, this may mean that you're going to eat a lot of lentils. Because you probably can't afford the good meat. And so, I'm sorry, you guys it's vegetables. It's vegetables for you.
How distressed she looks.
Yeah. Not only that, but the entertainment, because you guys are poor, the only entertainment that you really enjoyed was the theaters because they were free. And the problem with that is, probably for all of you really, That was your fun entertainment, and the theaters are all connected with the god Dionysus. They're very clearly set up to worship and promote the god Dionysus. So that's not going to work out so well for you guys anymore either. So you're bored and eating vegetables. I don't know what to tell you. Good luck. Good luck to all of you.
Well, it sounds like I got the easiest job here. 'Cause I have the least to
I love it.
drop that on us.
Thank you.
Well done, Sarah, well done. That's awesome.
Okay, so
You're
back
just
to
gonna
you.
do that and leave?
Yeah, just, okay.
You know, after hearing your guys' stories, I'm happy with my story.
You know who I feel sorriest for is Karen, no barbecue cheeseburgers.
Yeah. Lentils for you.
Oh, well.
Ruined my whole life.
I mean, I just,
Well, anyway, the whole point of that, as you can see, is it wasn't easy.
No.
It was
Yeah.
not easy to be a new believer, especially if you're a Gentile and you still have to live in that Gentile
Yeah.
community, because your life is going to change so dramatically. And you have tough decisions you have to make. So, all right, we will pick this up again and we'll have to reread what it was already read next time. So, Ken, would you mind praying for us?
Yeah.